Our next keynote, Sarah Tofte, is the Director of Research and Implementation at Everytown for Gun Safety. I'm sure you have heard of that organization, but please give a warm welcome to Sarah.
Hi, good morning. It's really great to be here. It's such an honor to speak to all of you. As they noted, I'm Sarah Tofte. I'm the Director of Research and Implementation for Everytown for Gun Safety. So let me just start by telling you a little bit about Everytown. We're a movement of Americans working to end gun violence in this country, and we've got a lot of great support. We have 3 million grassroots members made up of survivors of gun violence, moms, mayors, law enforcement, policymakers, politicians, and we advocate for evidence-based policies to end gun violence in this country and to advance good gun sense policies at the state and federal level. I want to sort of start out by grounding us in the impact of gun violence in this country. For many of us, if we think about gun violence, we might understand and think about it in terms of deaths. And we know that at least 36,000 Americans die every year from gun violence. That's about 93 a day, and that number is rising. But research actually just coming out in the last few years shows us the sort of full, comprehensive, and devastating impact of gun violence in this country. And helps us understand better what kind of comprehensive solutions we need. We know that there are at least 2 times as many injuries from gun violence every year. Those that are injured but survive, about 85,000 Americans a year are injured from gun violence. We know that when it comes to domestic violence, for example, that about 600 women die every year from gun violence, are killed by their intimate partners, but an additional 4.5 million women report being threatened by guns from a domestic abuser in their lifetime. We're learning a lot more about how many people are witnessing gun violence. We know that 8% of American children report that they have been exposed to gun violence in their lifetimes. And we're learning so much more about how many Americans have a personal connection to gun violence. Almost nearly half of Americans report that they know someone who was directly impacted by gun violence, either someone who was killed or injured or witnessed a shooting, right? So I think just grounding us in these numbers helps us understand how big of a public health crisis this is and what kind of solutions we need to move forward. So I want to dig into one aspect of gun violence, the intersection between domestic violence and gun violence, as sort of a way to illustrate both the kind of policies that Everytown works on and how essential what an essential role data plays in advancing those policies. So again, over the last several years, as there's been a sort of advancement in the kind of research that we do in this country around gun violence, it's become increasingly clear the ways in which gun violence is deeply interconnected with domestic violence and vice versa. We know that most intimate partner homicides in this country are committed with guns. More than all other weapons combined. And in an average month, 51 American women are shot to death by a current or former intimate partner. We also know that when a gun is present in a domestic violence situation, it increases the risk of homicide for women by 500%. And as I said before, we're learning a whole lot more about the ways in which guns play a role in domestic violence, not just in terms of deaths and injuries, but how pervasive guns are as a way to threaten women in domestic violence situations. Research out just a few months ago from the CDC also showed us how children are impacted by guns in domestic violence situations. Most children who die in gun homicides, those gun homicides are connected to domestic violence. The good news is there's also been quite a bit new research that shows us what works in terms of decreasing or preventing domestic violence, intimate partner gun homicides. Research out just actually a few days ago tells us that separating abusers from their firearms, requiring convicted domestic violence abusers to turn in their guns once they are convicted of domestic violence, or if they're under protective order, is responsible for decreasing domestic violence gun homicides by 14% at the state level. It's why that particular policy, making sure that states have laws that require domestic abusers to turn in their guns, it's why that's a policy that we work so hard on at Everytown at the state and federal level. And I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which some of the research and data that we've gathered around this is helping us move these policies forward. So I want to use Rhode Island as an example. Rhode Island was a state that had a law on the books that allowed judges to sort of order domestic abusers to turn in their firearms, but did not require judges to do so. And about 3 years ago, we drafted a bill and started doing advocacy to change that state law so that judges no longer had discretion, that abusers had to turn in their firearms upon conviction or when they were under a protective order. And one of the things that we ran up against, we had a lot of support, theoretical support for this policy, but what we were being told by our supporters on the ground, our allies there, was that they thought judges were using their discretion appropriately in these cases. If they had to guess, although we didn't have any underlying data, but if they had to guess, they thought judges were probably ordering relinquishment more often than not in these cases because judges, they assumed, understood this deadly connection between domestic violence and guns. And certainly they thought if judges were aware that the abuser possessed guns at the time of conviction, of course, that they would order relinquishment. So the first year we tried to pass this legislation, we struggled quite a bit because we struggled against the perception that judges were doing a pretty good job with their discretion. So what we decided to do as the research team to go in and figure out how judges were actually applying their discretion in these cases. So we got access to every final domestic violence protective order issued in Rhode Island over a 2.5-year period. And we analyzed every single one of those orders. We looked at the entire case file and looked at how judges were making decisions around relinquishment. And what we found was this. Of all those final protective orders, judges were only ordering relinquishment in 5% of all cases. And in addition to that, we looked through to see when there were indications that an abuser had access to a firearm, did that change judges' decision-making? Barely at all. Even in those subset of cases, judges were still only ordering relinquishment 13% of the time. And we also saw, a pretty significant variation across certain courtrooms, although for the most part, again, more likely than not, judges were not ordering relinquishment. So we also, again, looked at some of these case files, and we could use some of the case files to supplement our data, right? We could see that, you have victims writing to the judges explaining sort of what their abuser had threatened to do. In this case, someone indicating that he had threatened to blow her head off and that he was going to put a gun to her head. And yet still we could see that the judge decided not to order relinquishment. And it was a combination of having this data to show people on the ground who were supportive of this policy but didn't think it was necessary. We could show them that actually it was essential if you want to separate abusers from their firearms. Knowing what we know and knowing what the data showed us, you need to change your policy at the state level and require judges to order relinquishment. And I'm so happy to say that actually after a 3-year battle, just on, I want to say Wednesday or Thursday of last week, the Rhode Island legislature passed a law requiring relinquishment for all domestic abusers, and the governor signed it. So that's the good news, which is great and really important. But the other thing I get to do, I'm the director of research and I'm the director of our implementation team, right? The other thing that we know is, and we know this from research, is that even, this study that I just cited that shows that separating domestic abusers from their firearms, 14% reduction in intimate partner gun homicides. Even in that study, the researchers said, we know that the impact of these laws is being blunted by poor implementation, right? I'm sure you've all seen this in your areas of work, that passing a good law is important and it's essential, right? But there's often significant gaps between a good law on the books and its actual implementation on the ground. So as the implementation team, we go in after a good law is passed. We'll be in Rhode Island starting next week, actually, thinking about implementation. But we go in after a good law is passed and try to identify sort of some of the barriers to good implementation. So I want to give you sort of an example of that work from what we're doing right now in Colorado. So Colorado passed a great domestic violence relinquishment law in 2013. It looks very similar to Rhode Island's relinquishment law. And we had been hearing from folks on the ground that it didn't, that judges were actually not ordering relinquishment when they should be, according to the law, and that abusers were sort of not being held accountable for complying with this good law. But we were also hearing from some of the key stakeholders, the judges themselves, the prosecutors, family court judges, that they thought probably the law was working good enough and there weren't enough significant problems to sort of change course, to actually come up maybe with, say, some comprehensive protocols or tweak the law a little bit to encourage implementation or get more resources for implementation or training, all that good stuff. So we did something, again, similar to what we did in Rhode Island. We went in to see if we could show, certainly we could supplement some of these anecdotes we were hearing about the law not working as it should with some data. And the first thing we did in Colorado, the state was not actually tracking how judges were ordering relinquishment. So we worked with the state court administrator's office to get them to actually start tracking this information to see what we could see. And so there was, and they just were able to give us that data a few months ago. And so there's some good news and bad news in what they showed us, right? I think the good news is that if you see in 2013, the law went into effect halfway through 2013, or the difference between 2012 and 2013, we're starting to see an uptick in the number of judges that are ordering relinquishment. And then after sort of a full year of the law being in effect, we certainly see the way in which the law has influenced judges' behavior, right? More judges are ordering relinquishment, which is great. But obviously, you see, there's quite a bit of bad news as well, right? 36% is not a great rate, right? This should be really 100%. And I think, again, what's been so interesting for me and a little bit surprising is the ways in which judges feel particularly comfortable with just not actually following the law. The law is very, very clear in Colorado. The law says judges must order relinquishment, right? So this was helpful for us to see, I think, both to encourage folks on the ground. The tough thing about implementation is you don't want to deflate sort of enthusiasm and morale for these good laws, right? So we could show that while the law was having an impact, it's not having enough of an impact and we need to do better. We also saw from the data significant variations across districts, which again, you should not see, both because again, every jurisdiction should be at 100%, but also because we know enough about domestic violence in Colorado to know that there's not enough variations of the nature and dynamics of domestic violence across counties to see this kind of variation in relinquishment orders, right? So we had some jurisdictions that were ordering relinquishment in over 60% of cases, and then you had some jurisdictions that were ordering relinquishment in less than 5% of cases. Now, again, this data was especially helpful for us because we knew, one, we will go and have plans to go sort of jurisdiction by jurisdiction to think about some of this at the local level. But it also helped us understand that this is truly a statewide problem. That again, even the best performing jurisdiction is still only performing at about 60%. And there's so many variations across the state that it helped us understand that not only do we need a local solution, but we also need a state solution as well. And having this data has helped us get the attention of the state actors that we need. Governor, state legislators, the chief court administrative office to join us in helping us think think through a little bit what else we need to do on the ground to be able to move these reforms forward, right? We also were able to supplement sort of this, the numbers we had with, again, case files that we were pulling from every jurisdiction, just to help people understand. Because what the questions we were getting from folks is, well, how is this happening? And why would judges, it was hard for them to believe that judges were not doing what they were supposed to do. So these case files also helped us to sort of in a very tangible way help people understand exactly how this was playing out, and help people, I think, believe on another level that we did sort of have some gaps in implementation here, right? Again, just an example of a case file here from Pueblo, Colorado, where, again, it's very clear that in this case the judge should have ordered relinquishment and for whatever reason did not. Right? So again, this is the kind of information that can really help us both sort of move reform forward in Colorado. And what it's also going to do is give us some lessons learned from barriers to implementation in that state, and we can take those to states like Rhode Island. So we make sure that all the hard work that we did to get those laws passed in Rhode Island sort of doesn't go to waste, and we sort of get the most out of it, right? So, you know, again, this focus on domestic violence and the connection between firearms and domestic violence and all the data that we are getting now from outside researchers and the data that we're creating ourselves at Everytown is allowing us to do really several key things to implement policies that are going to end gun violence in domestic violence situations and ultimately gun violence in this country, right? We need that data about, you know, how many women are threatened with guns in domestic abuse situations, how many women are killed and injured, how many children are impacted, and thus how the community is impacted. We need that to both establish this strong connection between firearms and domestic violence and to move our allies and stakeholders and policymakers to do more. We sort of then need to understand what policies work in order to know what to push for. And then we need to understand how badly we need those policies by sort of exposing, like we did in Rhode Island, the gaps that current sort of less comprehensive policies leave and how they make domestic violence victims more vulnerable to firearms and the threat that they pose. And then we need to really understand, once we get those good policies in place, we need to understand that poor implementation is blunting their impact so that we can think more comprehensively about the kind of resources and support and attention that needs to be paid to fully more implement the laws and make sure we're saving, you know, all the lives that we can. So thank you so much for having me here. So grateful to talk to you all, and enjoy the day.